Am I? Okay, thank you so much, Alex. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Scott, our speaker for today. Scott Robinson was born and raised in Pittsburgh. He was taught about birds by his father, who was an avid bird watcher. Scott started doing research while he was an undergraduate at Dartmouth, working in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. While he was in college, he took a gap year and did a North America big year, which we're going to hear about. He then went to graduate school at Princeton, where he studied Amazonian birds. During the research, he also set the world record big day, a record that lasted for 34 years. And after getting his doctorate, he taught at the University of Illinois for 20 years before taking a position at the University of Florida at the museum, where he is still currently. And I just want to say a few things about Scott's records, because he's very modest about some of these achievements that he's done. So his big day was back in September of 1982. They saw 331 species in Peru in one single day. And just to top that off, in October of 2018, he and a team of other, I think most of them were for UF, but ornithologists and scientists set another big day record on that day for 374 birds. And if that's not enough, if you are an eBirder, and Scott is an avid eBirder, as I know, if you look at the world all-time eBird list, this is everybody in the world that does eBird. He is number 35 on there with 7,211 species. So I just want to say how lucky we are to have Scott in our midst and to tell us about his big year, North America big year, and back in 1976, when there were no cell phones, emails, text, or eBird. So it is my privilege and pleasure to welcome Scott Robinson.
Thank you very much, Liz. That was a very generous introduction, and I really enjoy the fact that there's a Marion County Audubon Society that's very active, and we are actually cranking out lots of birds in this county now. We haven't quite gotten to the level of Alachua yet, but we're well on our way. So I'm glad to see you all here. So, but this talk is going to be a little bit unusual, because this was a big year I did when I was in college. I took a gap year, which was kind of a rare thing back then. Now it's commonplace. But I really wanted to travel around the world, and I sort of had the sense that the existing world records could, or the continental record could be broken, and I really thought this would be kind of a fun thing to do. I had some handicaps in all of this, but we'll get to those in a minute. Let's see, slide. Okay, did this advance? Yes. Okay. Oops. I meant to remove this one. But I do, as Liz mentioned, I do want to mention my father, William Robinson, who was a very avid bird watcher. And he was professionally he was a surgeon, and then ran an emergency room for a bunch of years after that. But he was a really knowledgeable about natural history. He did a lot of backpacking. He climbed mountains. And he exposed me to some very interesting hobbies. In fact, all of his children really went off and followed up pretty fanatically some of the hobbies that he introduced to us. But I also want to mention him because he was also one of the world's most competitive human beings I've ever known. He just competed on everything and gloated, and he always set the standards. It was never worth competing just for fun. You had to win. And if you had to win, you had to win some big record. So my bar was set almost ridiculously high when I was a kid, which was not always a good thing, of course. In fact, it was often not a good thing at all. But in some cases, it did have me looking for opportunities where I could do things that were on a really large scale. Not necessarily competing, like stomping on others, kind of competing that is, I think, a whole different kind, but competing against records or trying to break records. That was kind of our goal in all this, and that's one of the main reasons that I did this. Let's see, can you guys all hear me, by the way?
Yes, I can hear you just
Okay,
fine.
okay, thanks. So I'm getting phone calls from someone. Okay, so uh, I also wanted to give credit to a couple of books that I think we tend to forget just how important these birds were. This was the Robbins et al. Guide to the Birds of North America, illustrated by Arthur Singer. It was and the main author in this was Chandler Robbins, who was one of the great heroes of modern conservation science and especially bird science. This was the first field guide to have range maps and paintings, all the information on one plate. The old Peterson guide, which is what everyone used, all the plates were together, which had its advantages. But for me, having a range map and the description and the painting all right there, that connected with me in a way that was much, much stronger than it might have been otherwise. And so this guide really made me fanatical because I just loved looking at this book, studying it endlessly. And then another book, one of the very first, when I was a kid, I didn't really read that much, but one of the books I did read was Wild America, which is a book by Roger Tory Peterson and James Fisher, a British ornithologist who did a North American big year. They did a 30,000-mile tour of the continent. They visited all sorts of places, trying to see as many birds as they could. And this, just at the time I read this book, I thought, wow, this is just, I've got to do this sometime myself. And so that I had this kind of in mind, and then the big years themselves were starting to become fairly popular. Now, but again, you have to understand this was a really different world. First of all, I started the big year with only 505 species on my ABA, American Birding Association list. I'd never seen grouse lake, never been to Alaska, never seen the spring migration in Texas, West Coast pelagic, dry tortugas, the shortgrass prairie, these major areas I'd never visited. There was no up-to-date information available on where the rare birds were. So we just kind of went to historical places and hoped for the best. Oops, Juki, and then I was also committed to summer research from 15 May to 15 July, that should read. I just edited that a few minutes ago in New Hampshire. And New Hampshire is not necessarily a good place for a big year. It's a pretty state and all that, but summer in New Hampshire is not particularly birdy. So I lost a couple months right out of there. But it wasn't really until the fall when I realized that I wasn't going to break the record unless I started being ruthlessly efficient, that I did the first ever semi-modern big years, just flying from one rare bird to another, scattered all over the continent to try to break the record. Because by the end of the year, the rare bird alerts started appearing. When you would call a number, it would tell you where the rare birds were and tell you how to get there. And so at the very end of this year, I started doing a more modern big year. And frankly, I had no fun at all. I mean, there was not a lot of joy in it. There was just the list. There was just this record that I needed to break and the limited amount of time to do it. Fortunately, for Eastern Airlines, one of the many defunct airlines, had a ticket you could buy with unlimited flights, but you always had to go through Atlanta. If you were flying from Los Angeles to San Francisco, you had to fly through Atlanta. But if you did that, you could go anywhere. And I flew relentlessly and again, finished off the year. But the early part of the year was just pure fun. I was experiencing the continent's greatest birding phenomena. I also did the gap year, as Liz mentioned. But Dartmouth did allow me to do this. I actually took the calendar year off. And this was something that was pretty uncommon. Now, the big year history of this was, it sort of all started with James Fisher and Roger Tory Peterson, but it was never called that. But then Ted Parker, really, the guy in the upper right hand there, he actually pretty much started modern big year birding. He only did the lower 48, but he just decided that the year, this to establish a record. He had 630 species, some extraordinarily good number for not going to Alaska. And Ted was pretty much the greatest birder of his age. And so he made this very popular. And then Ken Kaufman down here, the Kingbird Highway, a book well worth reading. He actually broke Ted's record of going to Alaska and got a huge amount of publicity for it and became quite famous and has written many, many field guides and led many tours. And And I had their record to break. But I knew their record was breakable because again, we were all just going to the same places. And because I had their record, I knew I could arrange it to win. So there was a little bit of a cheat. And then in fact, after I did the year and they realized I only birded for half the year, this guy Jim or James Vardaman, Jim Vardaman, went and did the really modern big year, trying to break 700 in a year, which I know is fairly routine now, but back in the day, the top North American birders only had 700 species. And then since then, every year, pretty much someone tries to break this record. There was a movie about this, The Big Year, but my students in ornithology class here always ask me, so which one are you, Scott? And I usually say, well, probably Jack Black. So I don't know if you've seen this movie. It's actually not a bad movie. And again, here's Ted and Roger Tory Peterson talking at one point, and they're two of the great people. Again, look at the cameras of the time, these little film cameras and all. Ted Parker was a very good friend of mine, but he was tragically killed in a plane crash that killed the greatest tropical ornithologist and the greatest tropical botanist in the world in Ecuador when they went out trying to around bad weather, trying to get a look at some possible study areas. Now, again, there were some guides available. There were bird finding guides, such as A Birder's Guide to the Texas Coast. Jim Lane and various co-authors had a series of these books. So I had some information on at least where to go. And then there was these old books by Olin Sewell Pettengill, the Eastern and Western bird finding. My copies are so worn you can't see anything other than just they told you where to go. I use these books quite a bit, but often it was pretty depressing because the places that were really nice back in the 50s when these books were written had often been severely altered. And then there was the Birding magazine, which was quite new at the time, but they had these little inserts. Here's the inserts for various birds, the harlequin duck, how to find one of those, black Franklin, an invasive bird that was countable back then, but is now extirpated, tricolored blackbird. And I would use these things again to just try to design my trip. Now, the facts of the year are pretty straightforward. I had 657 species, breaking the old record by about 5. In the modern taxonomy, that's about 677. I visited 46 different states, drove 65,000 miles, flew all over the place on Eastern Airlines at the end. I lived out of a van for most of the year, birded for about almost exactly half the year, and I never got to the Aleutians. If I'd gotten to the Aleutians and in July, I probably could have broken 700. Again, I just barely broke Ken's record. There's another birder named Floyd Murdoch who did a year, but didn't quite beat Ken's record. Now, again, I'm sorry, if I really knew anything about good graphics, I could have all sorts of little lines migrating us around. But I started out in Pennsylvania. Can you see my pointer? Apparently not. Can you see my pointer now?
Yes, I can see the
Oh,
mouse
good.
now.
Okay. I started out in Pittsburgh and went up to New Hampshire to visit my friends in winter up at Dartmouth, which is right here on the border. And my car broke down up there, and I lost 35 days as I tried to order a part for my car that apparently didn't exist. So during this time, I didn't do a lot of birding. It was very inefficient, and but there are some pretty cool birds up there. Oops, I'm sorry, I forgot. Again, forgot. But okay, it is worth pointing out that when you do a big year, you spend most of your time in New England, Florida, of course, Texas, Arizona, California, Colorado, and Alaska. You can almost do an entire big year with just these states or regions. And I did a little bit of birding in other places such as Maine, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, British Columbia, Oklahoma, and indeed some of these places I even forgot Missouri. But these are places you go for just single birds. So again, the year started very slowly. The car broke down, and this was also what we called the Little Ice Age back then, or what has since been called the Little Ice Age. The late 70s was a period of incredible cold. It was 36 degrees below zero one morning, which is pretty much the same in Fahrenheit and centigrade. And it was 20 below every single night that I was up in New England. And it was really hard to get around. The cars didn't work well. But there are some great birds up there that are worth mentioning. Skuas, puffins, razorbills, which are dovekies, winter finches. And there were some of these birds were just all-time classics. A lot of the great rarities of the era were being found in Massachusetts, which has always had the largest, at least always traditionally had the largest bird watching community in North America, which has been far exceeded by California. Let me see, I've got a chat here. Yeah, well, actually, bird tax. Yeah, I am actually going to talk a little bit about bird taxonomy at the end. So yes, I will definitely do that. But there were snowy owls in invasion that year. We saw lots of them. And then this bird in the upper right here, the ivory gull, is a bird that may be one of the top 10 most threatened birds by global climate change because its entire habitat is melting, thawing away up north. But it is a very, very beautiful bird. And one of them showed up on Plum Island, one of the classic birding spots. And then, then there are a variety of other sites. There are a lot of other winter birds up there. The boreal chickadee, much sought after feeder bird, the Bohemian waxwing, northern shrike, the common redpoll. These are just northern winter finches, which I kind of took for granted growing up in the north. There were coastal birds. I took a boat trip off the coast and staggeringly cold weather, but we all managed to survive. Where you can see the puffins and dovekies, razorbills, and other birds. And then you get the winter finches, which back when I was a kid, these winter finches were regularly invading the east. So sometimes they even made it to Florida. The white-winged crossbill was a bird I saw 15 or 20 different times. The pine grosbeak on the lower right there. This is just a very beautiful bird. They were being commonly observed all throughout the east. And the evening grosbeak, where you could see flocks of hundreds, even thousands of them in Tennessee and Georgia. Now you virtually never see these birds anymore. Their ranges have contracted back far to the north, and I don't know that we'll ever experience these winter finch invasions anymore. But in the mid 70s, they were really one of the highlights. You could see huge flocks of these things. They're colorful. They come to bird feeders. If you haven't seen them before, I strongly recommend you head up there. Again, these winter pelagics are most of the birds don't look that great in winter, but I did see a great skua, which is quite a rare bird up there, and the Atlantic puffin doesn't look so good. The razorbill, their winter plumage is not quite as spectacular. There were a few vagrants we went to see. This is a smew, which is essentially a Eurasian merganser that showed up in Rhode Island that I had to go looking for several times before I finally saw it. But I had to see this because I do consider this to be one of the world's most beautiful ducks. Now then, of course, I went to Florida. Now this all seems very old hat for you now, but Florida was, but for me, it was a place I used to visit a lot as a kid. In fact, I became interested in birds in Florida when my father bought me the Robbins Field Guide and took me down to, took me on a trip down to the Everglades where we saw yellow-headed blackbirds, and where I just blundered into a brant at Flamingo, which was I guess it was a known rarity back then, but I didn't know about it. And I was very thrilled to have seen a bird that was so far out of range. So I've always had a soft spot for Florida, which ultimately some of the main reasons I moved here 20 plus years ago. And we again, Florida was we all know all about birding there. The short-tailed hawk was definitely one of the birds you want to go after there. Tammy and Michelle and I saw the dark phase of this morning or this afternoon at Hoy. So if you want to see this bird now, they are occurring fairly regularly midday at the Marjorie Hoy lookout there. It's good to have a telescope because they soar very high, then plunge down very abruptly. But that's a really nice bird to see around here. And it's a bird that's very widespread in Central and South America, but it's definitely one of the most interesting birds around here. And birds such as the mangrove cuckoo, which you have to make special trips to see. A couple other sad things. The smooth-billed anis, when I went to Florida in the mid-70s, they were abundant in South Florida. You could see 50, 60 a day. They were in every pasture. They were showing up in people's yards. They seemed to be well on their way to becoming abundant. Their decline and now extirpation from Florida, except as a vagrant, to me is one of the great mysteries of all time, because they love trashed habitats everywhere in the New World. But when I came here in the 70s, they were easy. And of course, the dusky seaside sparrow in the upper right, which is not actually a species, but I I didn't know this at the time, but I visited their range. I heard them singing, but I never bothered to try to look for them because it was just a subspecies. And I'll come back and see it some other time. So I never had a chance to see this, and they were extirpated just a couple of years. They're actually extinct now, a couple of years later. So I blew that opportunity. But there were also some things back then that birds you used to have to work. You used to have to work to see a bald eagle. They were rare in the mid 70s. There were most of the remaining birds were here in Florida, and they weren't even all that common in Florida. And Florida had one of the very few populations of wild turkeys left in North America. Because there were virtually none in Pennsylvania where I grew up. There were just a few populations that had been released. So these are two birds that we now completely take for granted. But back then, they were very rare. And of course, the peregrine falcon was a bird you had to work very hard to see. They were just starting to introduce them into cities and to make a comeback. Okay, so from from Florida, we headed west towards Texas, which was the great state for birds. And the main goals there would be the good old whooping crane, which you used to have to take a boat trip. See, I think you still do. At the time of the trip, there were 55 birds in the wild, and I think 60 or 70 birds in captivity. The flock is much larger, but they've had a hard time getting them outside their historical range. And then a bird I didn't even know we still had in North America, the northern Gisanna, which had recolonized a wetland that I got to see. And for me, this was just a really exciting bird because I had no idea I had any chance of seeing that. But now I guess there's a bunch of populations. And then we went after these two mega rarities, the black and yellow rails. In fact, they used to take dune buggy or swamp buggies out to show these birds to birders. And I got great looks at both of these on these trips. I don't know if they do that anymore because these buggies really were pretty damaging to the marshes. But this was a huge thrill for me, I have to admit. Then we went down to the Rio Grande Valley, which is again the Altamira oriole, the green kingfisher, just lots and lots of Mexican birds, lots of Central American birds that barely make it in. But many of these birds are extremely common a little bit further south. Green kingfisher, I think, makes it all the way down to Chile and Argentina. But for North America, they were lifers and exciting. And you get down to the actual border itself, and you could see hook-billed kites, masked ducks, and green jays. These are, again, all extremely wide-ranging birds that just barely make it into North America. Hook-billed kite, this was the first time this bird had been seen in North America for decades. But now they've become quite regular. There's other birds you can see around here. The red-billed pigeon, I saw one of them flying the whole year. In the early spring when I was there, the lark bunting was staging its migration. I saw tens, if not hundreds of thousands of them moving northward through the Texas dry lands, the various deserts and grasslands. It was a spectacular sight. Their population is probably 90% fewer than they used to be, but when I was there, they were still abundant. And then the good old buff-breasted sandpiper, which for some reason I haven't seen this year in Marion County. Usually they're semi-regular in turf farms around here, but I'm not aware that anyone has seen any this fall yet. I know they've been seen in large numbers outside of Marion County. And then we went to the Texas coast in April, a little bit later, saw this, I never saw one of those legendary fallouts where you can thousands of birds in a day, but we did have a pretty good, I saw all these birds along the coast, many of which were pretty significant. The cerulean warbler, worm-eating warbler, which is passing through here in numbers now. Cerulean warbler, which Tammy found in over in Marjorie Hoy, Orange Lake Overlook. Swainson's warbler, which there's one of them up in Alachua County now. Golden-winged warbler, which is being seen quite a bit now, including by Tammy, and Kentucky warbler, which seems scarce, at least in my yard this year. But you can see these birds in large numbers, but I never had one of those great fallout days there. From there, we went from Texas over to Arizona. Anyone who's been, who knows anything about birds knows this area in southern Arizona is one of the great birding areas left in North America. In fact, probably the finest Mexican mountain, Sky Island forests left in the world are in Arizona. A lot of the Mexican forests have been cut or they're off limits now because of the dangers of traveling there. There are a lot of just classic birds you can see. There, crystal thrasher alpha owl up there, the varied bunting. These are just birds that birders come from all over the place. One of the birds that really interested me was the Baird sparrow. A scientist named Ron Pulliam, who is now one of the most famous uh, avian ecologists in the world, he discovered a wintering population up there and looked at their habitats and ecology and you know, he didn't know me at the time, but I called him up and he told me where to find them. And I just remember seeing this bird. That was just a huge thrill. It doesn't look like much, but it is. You know, grassland sparrows are something that I've hadn't had much experience. You get up in the Sky Islands and you get these classic birds, the Mexican chickadee, which is in the Chiricahuas mainly, the elegant trogon, which is a very, very widespread, important tropical order of birds, but it's there's only one species that regularly makes it north of Mexico. There's another one, there's a quetzal that shows up every 40 or 50 years. And then the Sky Island warblers, which are, you know, just classics, the birds you really want to go see. The painted redstart, upper right, and the red-faced warbler here are birds I really wanted to see. We used to think the olive warbler was a warbler, but when they did the molecular genetics in this bird, they discovered it's its own family. It's a one bird family. It's one of the most obscure birds in the world, the Pusidremidae. After that, we went to California just to try to see a bunch of the mountain birds and take a bunch of boat trips, especially off San Diego, but also up in Monterey Bay. Eventually, we did boat trips off the Pacific coast as well. I was fortunate to be one of the last times you could see wild California condors. There were still 25 or 30 birds soaring in the wild, but their numbers were disappearing pretty fast. And so eventually they had to bring them all back into captivity to try to save them. And I'm sure you're all very well aware of the history of that. But seeing that flock of condors, I think there were 17 of them, that was one of the top birding experiences of my entire life. The pelagic trips off the West Coast are amazing. The East Coast ones are underrated, but there's nothing compared to what you see. You know, the fulmar on the lower left here, the red-billed tropic bird. You saw I think this is the ashy storm petrel. I hope it is anyway. The crabberies and, you know, these are very little murrelets that live down there. And this particular bird here, which we see in Florida, the Sabine's gull, but for me, I didn't know much about it. I think this is, again, one of the world's most beautiful birds. I just love this bird. I'm going on a boat trip this weekend, I think maybe, if the weather cooperates, which it isn't right now, where we apparently have a chance to see them. The Monterey pelagics are you know, famous for, you know, the black-footed albatross, the Buller's shearwater, fork-tailed storm petrel, rhinoceros auklet. You can just see all of these birds, and they're fairly pleasant short trips. Unlike the Florida coast, where you have to get into the Gulf to get out of the shallow coastal water. The deep water is immediately offshore off California, so you don't have to go very far offshore to start seeing these birds. In fact, you can see most of these birds from land if you get decent westerly winds. The Pacific Northwest, you had a few more short-billed shearwater red-faced cormorant, either Cook's petrel, which I saw up in Alaska. I didn't know what it was at the time, but looking back on it, that's certainly what it was. Tufted puffin, just a magnificent bird. But after these pelagic trips, I came west and started going into the prairie, starting out here, mostly in Colorado. I just worked my way eastward through sage grouse leks and, oops, I'm sorry, I'm not doing anything amusing. Worked my way through here and spent a lot of time in Colorado looking at grouse leks. At least in April, this is one of the best places to be if you want to see these grouse leks, and I did. There were both prairie chickens, the greater and the lesser, were in full display. I guess it turns out these aren't, you know, the greater and lesser prairie chickens are going to be lumped. They're barely different at all genetically. So I'm going to lose a lifer here, but that's all right. But, you know, they're lesser prairie chickens on shortgrass prairie. The greater prairie chicken was a tall grass prairie bird. And seeing their leks is something you just have to do. I got directions from a local game warden who befriended me when I was on the trip, and he sent me out to a lek. But at the time I didn't know, but my odometer was reading too low. The whole time I thought I was driving 60. Back then the speed limit was 55. I was actually driving 52. And anyway, I wound up, you know, stopping the car in the middle of the night and sleeping out in the prairie. when I woke up, I heard scratching and strange sounds, and it turns out I had parked right in the middle of the lek, which is a horrible thing to do. I mean, that I thought I was in a nice, comfortable viewing position, and I had to wait, which was very hard with a full bladder, for a couple hours inside the car. But it was interesting. The birds sat on top of the van on display. They didn't seem terribly bothered by the presence of the car. It was an absolutely fascinating thing to do. There was the sage grouse Lex. This is again just one of those amazing things you have to see in life. These things just displaying, and the females displaying to each other and displaying to the females, and then one female chooses one of the males, and then virtually all the rest of the females choose the same male. There were some the long spurs are up there. The full breeding plumage is beautiful. What used to be called the McCown's longspur, it's been changed to the thick-billed longspur, chestnut collared longspur. These are two birds that are well worth seeing in the prairie. The sharp-tailed grouse is up there, and also the mountain plover, which is one of my favorite birds. We don't have them. I don't think there may be one or two records in Florida, but it's pretty endangered bird now. They need prairie that's been heavily damaged. There's some people think that they were dependent on badgers that used to rip up most of the prairie back when they were abundant. So these this is just something that I urge you to do at some point. The dry tortugas. Well, after leaving there, I ran into Ken Kaufman, and we actually, these slides are out of order. After I did, I went to the ABA convention in Houston, met Ken Kaufman, and we decided to drive from Rockport to Florida to do a trip to the Dry Tortugas, and we stopped at a restaurant, Alum's Restaurant, at 2 a.m. in Baton Rouge, which is right off Interstate 10 there, and just completely randomly to have some coffee and food. And an entire crowd of people from Louisiana State University, including many famous ornithologists and Ted Parker, was eating at that restaurant after spending a night, I think, watching basketball and having fun. And so the former world record holder, the current continental record holder, Ken Kaufman, and I was hoping to be future person, all by accident ran into each other at 2 a.m. in a restaurant in Houston. Anyway, we kept going. We went out to Dry Tortugas, and of course you all know what's out there: the sooty tern, the brown noddy, the brown booby, the masked booby, and the black noddy weren't there then. This is Ken Kaufman, by the way. And this is the Bahama mockingbird. And when I was there, I saw, hey, Ken, there's a strange looking mockingbird over here. And he walked over, he knew what it was. I didn't, embarrassingly enough. I never even heard of a Bahama mockingbird, but it was North America's first record. I know there are lots of records since then, but that was the one extreme vagrant I saw in the whole year. Now after the Hubbard Brook thing, or after this, I drove home and went up to New Hampshire and spent the summer in New Hampshire, which is really quite a pleasant place. I worked for a guy named Richard T. Holmes, who, to my mind, was pretty much the greatest bird community ecologist of the era. But there were some fine birds up there. The olive-sided flycatcher, which for some inexplicable reason doesn't migrate through Florida. The Philadelphia vireo, which will be showing up in another couple of weeks. In my experience, they're fairly predictable here in the first couple of weeks of October. I studied this bird. I did my undergraduate senior thesis on it, published my first paper on their interaction with red-eyed vireos. And I had a great time that summer. It definitely didn't help my birding, but this bird is now almost completely gone from New England as a breeding species. No one has any idea why. But I'm still the only practicing ornithologist who has ever studied this species. It is so hard to observe, and it's so similar to red-eyed vireos on the breeding grounds. The songs are essentially identical. That is very, very hard to study. There are also some thrushes like there was Bicknell's thrush there, which I did see for the big year. And we were also engaged in some of the most extensive studies being done anywhere in the world for birds such as the black-throated blue warbler, which is one of the best studied birds in the world now, thanks to this research being done in the White Mountains in New Hampshire. I did take one pelagic trip up there. We saw some very interesting birds, Wilson's storm petrels up in the upper left here, and Manx shearwater, greater shearwater, Pomeranian Jaeger, South Polar skua. These are things we can see off Florida every once in a while. But again, these are just magnificent birds that made somewhat fun. Then I had these two birds here, which I was lucky to see. By missing the late spring and summer, I made it extremely difficult to find Kirtland's warbler and Connecticut warbler. I did find Connecticut warblers just by the chip note, which I had learned in Pennsylvania when I was driving up to Alaska. And then the Kirtland's warbler, I just blundered into one that was still on its territory in the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. This was back when there were only 200 pairs of Kirtland's warblers, and they were all in 2 counties. They've now spread out of the area. But at the time, that was a bird I assumed I was going to miss, but I happily enough did. I missed a lot of other birds. So then we went up to Alaska, which at the time involved driving up through here, going up the Trans-Canada Highway, taking the Alaska Highway, the Alcan Highway up through, Alberta and northwestern British Columbia, Yukon, and then drove into Fairbanks, did McKinley, worked out here, took the Inland Ferryway down from there. So this was from Anchorage, we flew up to St. Lawrence Island up here where I was hoping to see some Eurasian vagrants. August is not the time to do that, as it turns out, so we didn't see very many. But this was the part of the trip that in many respects was the most memorable. Long-tailed Jaegers were still very common there. They were still breeding. The first and only hawk owl I've seen in North America, northern hawk owl was up there. You can see these birds were relatively easy, and there were some quest birds to me. The rock ptarmigan always fascinated me. The spruce grouse in the upper right there, and then the gyrfalcon, the white gyrfalcon, which we had to work pretty hard to see. But when I finally saw that bird, that was one of the happiest moments of my entire birding career. But again, the Asian birds that barely make it into Alaska include the yellow wagtail, the white wagtail, the blue throat, which we did not see, the northern wheat ear, which we did see. And these are birds that are very, very abundant, widespread Asian birds that in Alaska you have to work pretty hard to see. And this is why August isn't the nest time. So I think these are all corrections I was making just minutes ago. The two of the world's most beautiful ducks, the Steller's eider and the spectacled eider. This is what they look like in August. They're in full molt. This is the molt plumage, and they are eclipse plumage, they call it, and they really didn't look like much. But I got them on the list though. They were identifiable. But the alcid colonies up there in St. Lawrence, which have millions of alcids in them, they were still very much alive. The parakeet auklet, the least auklet, the crested auklet, you just saw tens of thousands of them flying in and out of these colonies. And again, that's just one of those things you have to do. We saw McKay's bunting on St. Lawrence Island. This is a very rare bird, very hard to see. The yellow-billed loon didn't look like much at the time, with a little upturned mandible there. And the emperor goose, which is just a magnificent bird. They were actually in pretty good plumage still. And then from there we drove back and started working our way down through picking up a bunch of birds we had missed earlier. Doing some mop-up work in famous places. Then we did a pelagic trip off Hatteras, which back then there was only one trip, but we saw a few interesting birds. We saw bridal tern and Corey shearwater and of course the black-capped petrel, the pterodrome petrels. These things back then we didn't even know there were still black-capped petrels. They only rediscovered the black-capped petrel a few years earlier. So we were still, the knowledge of birds was fairly primitive back then. I mean, what we know now is several orders of magnitude more than what we do then. And so in a way it was kind of pleasant because it wasn't all that hard to learn everything there was to know. And then we got to the end game where I just had a bunch of birds, vagrants that I needed to break the record. And I did that, just started traveling. I went to see the tufted duck, pretty much ignoring everything else around there. We saw this in Oakland with the ruff. We saw off Monterey, a really cool bird and all that. By the way, these pictures are all downloaded from the web. The Eurasian widgeon I had to see. There were a bunch of those up in British Columbia. the Montezuma quail, bird that we used to call the harlequin quail, but I worked very, very hard to see them, and I didn't find them until December. The Ross's goose, the little thing that we're starting to see in Florida now reasonably often, cackling goose. I'm sure I saw thousands of them, but we didn't. The only they weren't an official species back then. So these are just some of the birds we saw. This was kind of fun. I made my umpteenth trip to see a great gray owl, and although I heard them often enough, I never did see one. And back then, I only counted birds if I heard them or if I saw them. The various rosy finches, the black rosy finch, the brown-capped rosy finch, I hadn't seen those yet. They were feeder birds in winter near Colorado. Very beautiful birds. These are some of North America's only endemics. The last species I saw were on December 24th was the the Smith's longspur in the suburbs of Oklahoma City, and the good old Eurasian tree sparrow, which we saw just about 3 miles from the airport in St. Louis. These were just me just trying to break the record until we did it. And then we get to I'm not a good owl watcher. I never saw boreal owl. As I said, I never saw great gray owl. I heard one saw-whet owl. I never, the flame-related screech owl I never saw, but I heard. I saw one long-eared owl. I went to Duluth Hawk Ridge up in Minnesota to see them, but a bitter northern front arrived that night and drove all of these owls out. So the usually reliable spot was almost free of owls when I was there. And then I counted a bunch of birds back then. The ABA rules allowed you to count birds, such as the black francolin here, which is a Southern Asian bird, budgerigar, which used to be thousands, tens of thousands of these nesting in the Tampa Bay Clearwater area. The spotted dove, which used to be more abundant than the mourning dove in Los Angeles, which is in fact the ringed turtle dove, which was sort of an obscure cage bird that used to wander the streets in St. Petersburg, and the blue-gray tanager, a super abundant tropical bird that was released in Miami, and I was one of the last people to see them. So I had to spend a ridiculous amount of my life trying to find some of these birds, all of which winked out within a few years of me seeing them, and none of which I can count anymore. So I've lost quite a few birds from my list. I'm glad that they've split lots of species into several. There were a very few vagrants I mentioned. There was the black-headed little gull, the red-billed tropic bird, the Bahama mockingbird, hook-billed kite. Nowadays, when you do a big year, you spend all your time finding the vagrants, and you just assume you're going to see all the resident birds somewhere along the way. Every once in a while, you may spend a little bit of time going out to make sure you get to these things, but the art of doing modern big years is purely vagrants, just staying on top of them and going to get them. And this is really, it's a whole different kind of game. The logistics are everything, the planning, the tactics of them are incredibly complicated. It's a very, very interesting sort of, but it's a different kind of game. The big year I did was really pretty much oriented around seeing a lot of new birds. Now, I mentioned earlier that taxonomy has changed. What is a species and what isn't is something that is getting more and more refined almost every year. And two birds I went to see, the Caribbean coot in the upper left there was considered a good species, has a little bit more white on the shield and the forehead. Oops, sorry. And then the hoary redpoll, which is a very pale, more northerly version of the common redpoll. They've just been lumped in the latest checklist revision. So these are more species that I've lost due to taxonomy changes. But on the other hand, there are lots of other splits now. The scrub jay has been split into 5 species or 4 or 5 species. 4, yeah, so yes, 4 species. 3 of which I saw. And so on balance, you gain species when they decide that that species are going to, usually we add species, we only occasionally lump them. And so this is all based on science, including the science that people do here at the Florida Museum. Our new curator of birds, Glaucia Del Rio, is someone you should definitely invite to give a talk at some point, talk about her Amazonian work. She's just getting started here, and we're starting the Florida Bird Observatory. And so that's something we could talk about at some point too. So, I think at this point, that's 45 minutes. And so, be happy to answer questions or, anything you want to ask. That's it.
If you have any questions, you should be able to type them in the chat.
Okay.
While we're waiting for some people to type questions, I have a question for you. What are some of your favorite birding spots in Marion County?
Well, I'm kind of I'm a little bit parochial to the northern part of the county. Uh, I like the Orange Creek restoration area, but it turns out a lot of the most accessible areas there are not actually in Marion County. So I've pulled back a little bit from there. Uh, I love my yard. I'm a fanatical yard lister, but Valerie Wilmot and I are often often in the top 10 yards in the country for monthly lists. And then the Marjorie Hoy area is looking like it's going to be a really prime, great area for migration, and probably winter sparrows as well. Of course, WEC, the World Equestrian Center is amazing, but that's pretty well covered by the people in Ocala area. So I go down there occasionally, but I don't go there too much. And I spent a lot of time in the Ocala National Forest too, looking for the longleaf pine birds and the scrub jays. Um, so I tend to mostly cover areas up here in the north, just because there are many fewer of us up here working in the northern part of the county than there are down south. I used to love the sod farm, of course, but that's off limits now. So, of course, that's right. Yeah, the Ocala Sportsplex is amazing as well, and the Big Sun Soccer. I've seen a lot of Marion County birds in those places. So.
All right. I don't see any questions in the chat here.
Yeah, no,
I'll
looks like there are three of them. Uh,
uh
oh, you're right. No, they aren't questions. So, okay.
real quick before we stop, do you have maybe a birding blog or a website that we can refer people to?
Actually, I don't. I'm not very uh, savvy in that kind of thing. The social media stuff is something I haven't gotten into very much. My lab has a website you can find at the University of Florida if you want to find out all about the science we do here. In all honesty, the end of this big year was kind of when I realized that the full-time bird watching was not necessarily for me. That this kind of going after rarities was really, I didn't find that to be that much fun. I actually fairly happily went into the science. Of course, it helped. I did my thesis down in the Amazon basin, so I always had plenty of great birding to be done. But I found I more enjoyed getting to know areas well, like my network of sites in northern Marion County. I probably enjoy knowing those birds well, even though I never get a lifer here. I enjoy knowing those birds well more than I enjoy the kind of going, just tracking down rarities. It's just the way my particular mind works. Um, it's just kind of being the person who knows everything about a particular set of birds or a particular area.
Um,
Um,
Gregory Miller in the chat said, did you have a spotting scope back then?
yeah, I had an old Bushnell spotting scope, which by modern standards is pretty primitive, but actually the Bushnell optics, I had Bushnell binoculars too. Those Bushnell spotting scopes were fantastically good. They were fixed lens, 20 power, with tremendous field of view, very light, very easy to use. And it's really, the telescopes, you can't bird without a telescope, especially on the coast and shore birds. And it's a little bit hard to use scopes on boat trips, but sometimes they help as well. So,
All right.
um,
Well, thank you very much. That was a really, really nice presentation.
you're welcome.
I appreciate all of you coming out, and again, Scott, for coming out and telling us about way back when we didn't have iPhones. All right. me